Hello, welcome back to Artsy-Island-Girl. Today I'm going to make two different cards with two completely different techniques using the same stamp. So the first one, I'm going to create an alcohol ink background. So I have some glossy cardstock here, and I'm using different colors of alcohol ink from light to dark just to create a smooth, watery looking background. I'm using some isopropyl alcohol sprayed on the background, but I'm also using some blending solution. And the reason I'm using the blending solution is because I want to spray on some mica powders, and the blending solution has a little bit of a sticky consistency when it's dried, so I want to have a little tiny bit of a sticky surface for those mica powders to stick. So I'm just using a paintbrush to sweep those colors on the background, and then I added a little bit more color because I want to get a little bit more depth in my watery look here. So I'm just holding the card one way and letting it flow, and then holding it the other way, basically till it dries up. Then I have my fairy duster, and it's got some mica powder in it, and I'm spraying it over the wet alcohol ink, and that is going to create a little bit of a shimmer on my water when it's dry. So you can see here the little blue shimmer on there. So I have to wait for that to completely dry, and now I'm going to get my stamp ready. When stamps are created, there's a release agent put in the mold, and sometimes that release agent makes them resist ink. So the best way to prepare your stamp for ink is just to use a clear white, or not clear, just use a white eraser and rub it along the stamping surface, whatever surface you're going to be using against the ink, and then dust off all those little eraser bits. I'm using some Versamark ink and then some black embossing powder, and I'm going to stamp my whale tail stamp with the Versamark ink right onto the background. And obviously my alcohol ink is completely dried at this point. You don't want to do this when it's still wet, because if you do it when it's still wet, your embossing powder is going to stick to that background and it's going to be impossible to get a nice clear stamped image. So I'm going to pour the embossing powder over top of that image, and no need to worry about all that excess. I do it on top of a sheet of paper, so all of that's going to go right back into the jar. There's not going to be any waste there. You can flick your the paper with your hand to get any extra bits off of the areas that are not the stamped image, and then you're going to use your heat gun to melt the embossing powder. Now, you have to have a heat gun. This will not work with a hairdryer. A hairdryer is just going to dry up that ink and blow the powder off. A heat gun emits heat and it melts the powder right where it is. So you can actually see the powder as it's melting. It goes from a matte finish to a glossy finish. So it's really easy to see what parts are completely embossed and what parts still need to be embossed. And there's my embossed image there. So I didn't want to end there. I wanted the open parts from the stamp on the whale tail to be white, so I'm just using a galaxy marker to color that in. It doesn't need to be opaque white. I just wanted to have a little bit more whiteness. I didn't want the blue from the water showing through. You could also use a Posca pen, a Signal White gel pen, pretty much any white pen that you can fill in those areas. Or if you want, you could leave them as is. There's nothing saying that you have to fill them in. I just wanted to. Once that is done, I'm using some opaque grit paste, and I'm just going to dab it over that water area. I didn't really like how the lines on that water area was black because of my black embossing powder, and I wanted to add a little bit of glitter, a little bit of white foam, like watery foam there. So I'm just using the grit paste to do that, and I'm just stamping it up and down so that it has a bit of a rough texture to it. You could paint it on there smoothly if you wanted to have a more smooth finish to it. Entirely your choice. And once that is filled in, and I don't have any of the black watery areas that I don't want to be shown, I'm just going to put some clear holographic glitter on top. It's just to add a little bit of sparkle. It's not to really make it like in your face glittery. It's just going to add a subtle sparkle to that water part. And then we have to wait for that to completely dry. Once that is dry, I am going to do my card base and score it obviously before I fold it. Make sure it has a nice crisp edge there. I like to use Tombow Multi to glue my pieces to the card, and the reason I like using it is because you have about 5 seconds to shimmy everything in place, and then once it's dried for good. There's no way that anything is going to fall apart. If you try to take those pieces apart, they're going to rip. And I like knowing that I'm not going to have a card that's falling apart there. And that is my completed card. So you can still see a little bit of the shimmery background. So now I'm going to do a completely different technique with that same stamp. I kind of wanted to know if I did it in a gray, if it would look more like a dolphin tail instead of a whale tail. So I'm using Hickory Smoke Oxide ink, and I am stamping some watercolor paper. And I'm going to do a watercolor background for this one. So make sure to press the stamp really well to get all that solid area filled in. Now I did find with this ink it ended up being a little bit blotchy when I stamped it on the watercolor paper. I tried a few different times and there was nothing really that eased that. I tried a couple different watercolor papers, and then I also tried like doing that on one side versus the other. It still ended up being a little bit blotchy, but I'll show you in a minute my fix for that. So I'm going to emboss it with clear embossing powder so that that gray ink shows through. You could, if you wanted, use a Versamark ink and a gray embossing powder if you had it. I didn't have it. The only close thing to gray I have was silver, and it was not going to work in my opinion. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of Distress Oxide re-inker for the Hickory Smoke, the same color as the ink pad, and I'm just taking a brush and I'm painting it onto the blotchy areas that I didn't really like the finish on. Super easy to do this with a paintbrush, but it's going to fill some of those areas in for you. And then once the ink is on there, I'm going to take my clear powder again, put it over top, and then re-emboss it, just to get a more solid color for that tail. So that embossing powder is only going to stick to the areas that I have some wet ink there. So it's not going to stick to every part of the tail because I didn't paint in every part. I only painted in the parts that I wanted more solid. And then I am melting it. And again, you can see exactly when it's melted. It's going to go from like a matte finish to a glossy finish. Always best to hold your card and face the heat gun away from your hand because it does get quite hot. Even the heat that it's emitting gets quite hot. So that is my finished edge. It shows you the difference between how it was and adding that extra little bit of ink. So I'm using some liquid masket to cover those white areas of the tail because I'm going to do a watercolor background finish, and I don't want to have the watercolor bits go right through that tail. So I'm just using that. Need to wait till it's completely dry. It goes a little bit yellowy when it's dry, but you need to make sure you wait until it's totally dry. So I misted the background with water, and then I'm just using a watercolor brush and quickly doing a watercolor wash background to it. So the brush that I'm using, it's a flat, about a 1/2 inch brush, and it actually has water in the handle. So the nice thing about that is if I wanted to change the colors, I could squeeze that handle and it would flush out the brush, and I would have a completely clean brush to go with different colors. For this particular background, I'm using a bunch of different shades of blue, so I'm not even worrying about changing the colors. Now this is what not to do with your Perfect Pearls. I was trying to rush and I ended up getting far too much on my surface here. I'm just using these Perfect Pearls for the bottom part for the water to add a little bit of shimmer, so I definitely didn't need that much, but no worries. I took a piece of paper afterwards and I scooped up all the excess, so nothing went to waste, but better off to use a little bit of a spoon or a popsicle stick, or I like to use Slurpee straws and recycle them and use them as scoops in my powders and glitters. Better to use that and then only take out what you need. So now that my card is completely dried, I'm picking off the liquid masket. It ends up being kind of like a little bit of a rubber consistency. It's quite easy to take off. It does tend to split a little bit as you're taking it off, just because I've got such a thin coat on there. So you just have to pick it off a little bit. You could even use some tweezers to help you take it off, but it's not too hard. I've got it in so many different areas that I just have to pick all those little bits off there. But this way I've got some white parts on the tail rather than blue from the water. And once that is completely finished, I'm going to do my background, or the base of the card. So cut a piece of 8.5 by 11 down so that it is 8.5 by 5.5 and folded it in half. I'm gluing the watercolor piece to the background of the card with my Tombow Multi again, and then again shimmering it so it's nice and centered in the base of that card, and then let it dry. So this is the two cards that I have created out of the same stamp. So I ended up wanting to add that same bottom part to the dolphin tail, so I'm using my opaque grit paste and I'm just dabbing it on to the bottom of that tail there. I just found it kind of grounded it into the card. It just gave it a spot, like it just made it more of a focal point. And for this particular one, I have some blue satin pearl embossing powder. So it's a clear powder, but it's got a blue opalescent sheen to it. So I just wanted to see how that would look on the card instead of the glitter. You could easily use the glitter. I'm not sure how easy it is to find that particular powder. It's something that I've had for a while. So I'm embossing that powder right over the paste. Hard to see on the screen, but it did have a little bit of a blue opalescent sheen to it. And I wanted the white in the tail to be a little bit glossy. So I'm just using an embossing pen and I am coloring in those spots and then adding a little bit of that blue opalescent embossing powder to the tail. Now the tail must have been a little bit wet because it ended up, the powder ended up sticking to it. So I'm just using a brush here to take all the excess powder off because I'm trying to get it just in those lighter areas on the tail. So what that's going to do, it's going to be like you're still going to see the background of the card through it, but it's going to have a little bit of a blue opalescent sheen to it that's just going to catch your eye when you look at the cards. And there we go, now they're done. So you can see a little bit of the blue sheen on that tail, and then that one is completely black. I hope you enjoyed watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you want to see more.